Chapter 11, Friction as a Teacher. If reality functions as a curriculum, then one of the most important questions becomes unavoidable. Why does learning so often involve difficulty? Why does growth frequently emerge through circumstances we would never have chosen? Why do the same frustrations return? Why do relationships expose precisely the places where we are least prepared? Why do periods of expansion so often follow periods of disruption? And why does consciousness sometimes seem to develop most rapidly when everything familiar has been disturbed? The answer proposed by this framework is not that suffering is imposed as punishment. It is that friction reveals the places where consciousness and reality are not yet in alignment. Friction is what becomes visible when the present structure of consciousness encounters a condition it cannot yet smoothly accommodate. The obstacle, therefore, contains information. The resistance contains information. The discomfort contains information. The recurring pattern contains information. The curriculum teaches not only through what works, but through what does not. The meaning of friction. Friction occurs whenever movement meets resistance. In the physical world, friction is obvious. A wheel moves across a surface. A hand pushes against an object. Two surfaces interact. Movement encounters resistance. The same principle can be applied to consciousness. A person wants something. Reality does not provide it. Resistance appears. A person believes something should happen. It does not happen. Resistance appears. A person tries to maintain an identity that circumstances are changing. Resistance appears. A person attempts to control something outside their capacity. Resistance appears. A person repeatedly encounters the same kind of situation. Resistance appears again. From the perspective of the victim narrative, these events can seem like evidence that reality is working against the individual. From the perspective of the curriculum, they can be examined as feedback about the relationship between consciousness and circumstance. The question changes from, why is reality doing this to me, to, what is this resistance revealing about the way I'm meeting reality? That question opens a completely different field of inquiry. Suffering is not automatically punishment. One of the most persistent distortions surrounding karma is the assumption that suffering must represent punishment for wrongdoing. If something painful happens, the reasoning becomes, I must have done something bad, or reality is punishing me, or I am being tested because I failed. But this framework does not require such an interpretation. Pain can arise through countless forms of interaction. Bodies become ill, relationships change, people die, plans fail, resources disappear, circumstances shift, natural forces move through the world, people encounter the consequences of choices made by themselves and others. None of this requires reality to become a moral judge handing out sentences. Karma can operate without punishment. The distinction is between lawful consequence and moral condemnation. Fire burns according to its nature. Gravity acts according to its nature. A seed develops according to its nature. Likewise, the conditions through which consciousness encounters reality can unfold according to lawful order without requiring the universe to become an angry judge. The event does not have to be a punishment in order to be meaningful. It exists within the larger field of circumstances through which consciousness experiences its particular life. Inside resistance. Resistance often tells us something about the structure attempting to move through it. Suppose someone repeatedly becomes angry whenever they feel ignored. The external circumstances may vary. The underlying reaction remains remarkably consistent. The recurring anger therefore contains information. Something within consciousness is being activated, perhaps an expectation, perhaps attachment, perhaps a particular interpretation of recognition, perhaps an old samskara. The important point is that the repeated reaction gives the individual an opportunity to observe the structure. Without the triggering circumstance, the structure might remain invisible. The friction exposes it. This is why recurring difficulties can become spiritually valuable. They reveal what ordinary comfort allows us to overlook. The mirror of circumstance. Reality can function as a mirror without every event being reduced to a simple reflection of personal psychology. If consciousness contains particular tendencies, those tendencies influence what it notices, how it interprets events, what it chooses, what it avoids, and how it responds. Those responses then produce further circumstances. A person who distrusts everyone behaves differently from someone who trusts easily. A person who expects rejection behaves differently from someone who expects acceptance. A person who needs control behaves differently from someone who tolerates uncertainty. Each structure interacts differently with the same world. Over time, patterns emerge. The individual may then say, "Why does this always happen to me?" The curriculum asks another question: what remains consistent in the way I am meeting these situations? This does not mean every external event is caused by the individual's personal consciousness. The world is vastly larger than any individual personality. Rather, the deeper principle is correspondence. The outer event and inner structure meet. The circumstances surrounding the individual form part of the field in which consciousness is operating. The interaction produces experience. That experience reveals something. Resistance as a teacher. Resistance becomes especially informative when it is disproportionate. A small event produces an enormous reaction. A minor criticism creates intense anger. A simple delay creates anxiety. A small disagreement becomes a threat to identity. A change of plan feels intolerable. The intensity itself becomes evidence. Something deeper is being activated. The event may be small. The internal structure responding to it may be large. This is one of the most useful ways to approach friction. Instead of asking only, "Why did that person do this?" we can also ask, "Why did this affect me so strongly?" The first question investigates the external event. The second investigates consciousness. Both can matter. But the second is where development begins. Obstacles reveal capacity. The previous chapters established that consciousness cannot express beyond its present structural capacity. Friction reveals where that capacity encounters its current boundary. Imagine someone who has developed considerable patience in ordinary circumstances. Then they encounter prolonged uncertainty. Their patience collapses. The difficulty reveals that their capacity for patience was conditional. Or someone believes they have released attachment. Then something deeply important is threatened. The attachment suddenly becomes obvious. The person has not necessarily failed. They have discovered the edge of their present capacity. That discovery is valuable. Without the challenge, they might have mistaken conceptual understanding for integration. The obstacle reveals the difference. The edge of capacity. Every developmental stage has an edge. At one level, a person can remain calm under ordinary pressure. At another, they can remain calm when criticized. At another, when misunderstood. At another, when losing control. At another, when facing genuine uncertainty. Each new circumstance tests whether the previous development has become stable. This is why growth can feel strangely repetitive. A person thinks, "I already learned this." Then life presents a deeper version of the same lesson. The lesson may not actually be repeating, it may be deepening. The first encounter taught recognition, the second taught regulation, the third taught understanding, the fourth taught release. The fifth may reveal that the pattern no longer has power. What looks like repetition may actually be progressive refinement. Why challenge precedes expansion? Expansion requires structure capable of holding it. This principle appeared in Chapter 10. Chapter 11 adds another dimension. Challenge helps build that structure. Muscles strengthen through resistance. Skills develop through difficulty. Discernment develops through ambiguity. Patience develops through delay. Courage develops through fear. Detachment develops through impermanence. Compassion develops through encountering suffering. Wisdom develops through discovering that previous assumptions were incomplete. Challenge, therefore, creates conditions in which latent capacities can become active. Without resistance, certain capacities would remain theoretical. A person might believe themselves courageous without ever encountering fear. They might believe themselves detached without ever experiencing loss. They might believe themselves patient without ever experiencing delay. The challenge reveals whether the quality exists as an idea or as an integrated capacity. Circumstance as part of the curriculum. The curriculum is not limited to events that appear directly connected to personal choices. The larger field includes the circumstances into which consciousness enters. Birth itself is circumstance. Family is circumstance. Culture is circumstance. Geography is circumstance. Historical era is circumstance. Biology is circumstance. The people encountered throughout life are circumstance. The opportunities available, the limitations encountered, and the timing of significant events all form part of the environment in which consciousness unfolds. Consider an earthquake. The earthquake is a natural event, but the individual who experiences it is not separate from the cosmic field in which that event occurs. They were born into a particular place. They lived there during a particular period. They occupied a particular home. They encountered that particular event at that particular moment. The event does not need to be labeled a punishment, nor does every detail need to be reduced to a simplistic karmic equation. The deeper proposition is that nothing has to be outside the field of lawful unfolding simply because its immediate cause appears impersonal. The circumstance itself becomes part of the individual's lived curriculum. What consciousness encounters, when it encounters it, and what capacities are brought to that encounter all belong to the larger pattern. The difference between pain and resistance. There is also a distinction between pain and resistance. Pain is an experience. Resistance is the relationship consciousness develops toward the experience. A person can experience physical pain without adding psychological resistance. A person can experience loss while gradually accepting its reality. A person can encounter uncertainty without constantly demanding certainty. This does not mean becoming indifferent. Acceptance does not mean approval. It means recognizing what is already occurring. A great deal of unnecessary suffering can arise when consciousness insists, this should not be happening. But reality has already answered. It is happening. The curriculum begins when consciousness stops arguing with the fact of the event long enough to understand it. The second arrow. Traditional Buddhist teachings offer a useful illustration through the image of the two arrows. The first arrow is the unavoidable pain of experience. The second arrow is the additional suffering created through resistance, identification, and mental proliferation. The distinction fits naturally within the framework of karmic correspondence. The first event may be outside immediate control. The response to it reveals consciousness. This does not mean the response is always freely chosen. Chapter 7 established that action emerges from present capacity, but awareness can gradually alter that capacity. The individual may initially react automatically. Later, they recognize the reaction. Eventually, they may become capable of responding differently. That is development. The second arrow gradually loses its force. Friction and samskara. From the Indic perspective, recurring friction can be understood in relation to samskaras. A samskara is not simply a memory, it is an impression capable of influencing future perception and response. When circumstances repeatedly activate the same impression, the pattern can become visible. This is why certain experiences seem strangely familiar. Different people, different locations, different circumstances, same emotional structure, same attachment, same fear, same conflict, same response. The external details change, the internal pattern remains. The curriculum is pointing toward the structure rather than the scenery. The pattern beneath the pattern. Consider someone who repeatedly enters relationships in which they feel unappreciated. At first, the explanation may always be external. This person doesn't value me. Then another relationship produces the same experience. Then another. Eventually, a deeper question appears. What am I repeatedly participating in? Perhaps they select people who reproduce a familiar dynamic. Perhaps they tolerate behavior they should not tolerate. Perhaps they demand recognition from others because they have not developed an internal sense of worth. Perhaps the pattern is more complex. The point is not to assign a predetermined explanation. It is to move beneath the surface event. The curriculum asks us to investigate the repeating structure. That is where friction becomes useful. Obstacles as developmental feedback. An obstacle can be understood as information about the current relationship between intention and capacity. The person intends to move forward, something prevents it. There are several possibilities. The obstacle may indicate that the goal is poorly conceived, the timing may be wrong, the necessary capacity may be undeveloped, the environment may be incompatible, another person's agency may intervene. Or the obstacle may simply reveal that the present configuration of circumstances does not yet support the intended movement. The important thing is that the obstacle provides information. It tells consciousness something about the current configuration. The mistake is assuming that every obstacle means stop. Sometimes it means change direction. Sometimes develop capacity. Sometimes wait. Sometimes understand. Sometimes release. The obstacle does not always provide the answer. It provides a question. Brichard, when resistance becomes the lesson. Sometimes the external situation is not the primary lesson at all. The resistance itself is. A person wants reality to conform to a particular expectation. Reality refuses. The individual struggles against the refusal. Eventually, they discover that their suffering came less from the event itself than from the demand that the event be different. This is one of the deepest forms of karmic friction. The curriculum is no longer teaching, how do I change this circumstance? It is teaching, why must this circumstance be different for me to be at peace? That question can reach directly into attachment. The role of Dharma friction can also reveal Dharma. When a person repeatedly encounters circumstances that conflict with their deeper nature, the discomfort can become a signal that something is misaligned. This does not mean follow whatever feels comfortable. Dharma is not the same as preference. Sometimes Dharma requires tremendous difficulty. The distinction is whether the difficulty produces greater alignment with what is true, appropriate, and sustaining. A person may be comfortable living according to an inherited identity while feeling internally divided. Another may experience considerable difficulty while moving toward a life that is more aligned. Comfort alone cannot determine Dharma. Friction must therefore be interpreted intelligently. It is information, not an automatic command. The expansion that follows disruption. Many periods of profound development begin with the collapse of an existing structure. A belief stops making sense, a relationship ends, an identity becomes unbearable, a familiar environment disappears, a long-held assumption is contradicted. The person enters uncertainty. At first, this feels like regression. The old structure has disappeared, but the new one has not yet formed. This transitional period can be deeply uncomfortable, yet it creates space. The consciousness is no longer completely enclosed within the previous structure. Something has broken open. The disruption therefore becomes the beginning of expansion, not because suffering is inherently good, because the old structure could no longer contain the developing consciousness. The breaking of the shell. A useful image is a seed. The shell protects the seed, but eventually the same shell that protected it becomes something it must move beyond. The shell was not the enemy. It served its purpose. The breaking of the shell is therefore not destruction for its own sake. It is the completion of one stage of development. Human consciousness can experience something similar. A belief system protects identity. A routine creates stability. A relationship provides structure. A worldview provides meaning. But eventually, the consciousness may outgrow the structure. What once protected it begins restricting it. Friction appears. The structure resists expansion. Eventually, it breaks. The individual may initially experience this as loss. Later, it may be recognized as growth. When the lesson has been integrated. How does one know when friction has done its work? Often, the external situation does not need to disappear. The internal relationship to it changes. The same criticism no longer produces the same reaction. The same uncertainty no longer creates the same fear. The same temptation no longer carries the same force. The same relationship pattern is recognized earlier. The same loss is still painful, but no longer produces collapse. The event remains. The samskaric response has weakened. This is integration. The curriculum does not necessarily remove every difficult circumstance. It changes the consciousness encountering it, from compulsion to participation. Before integration, a person may feel compelled. They react, they repeat, they defend, they pursue, they avoid, they return. The pattern operates through them. After integration, something changes. The person sees the pattern before automatically entering it. There is greater discernment, greater space, greater capacity. The person can participate without being completely governed by the structure. This is one of the practical meanings of liberation. Freedom does not require an absence of circumstance, it requires a transformation in the relationship between consciousness and circumstance. Friction as karmic feedback. Karma can now be understood through another lens. Karma does not need to be imagined as a cosmic ledger recording sins and rewards. It can be understood as the continuity of interaction between consciousness and reality. A tendency produces an action. The action produces a consequence. The consequence creates experience. The experience reveals something. The response to that experience creates further momentum. The cycle continues until something changes. Friction is often where the cycle becomes visible. It is the point at which consciousness encounters the consequence of its present structure strongly enough to notice. The friction therefore carries information about karma in motion. The curriculum does not hate the student. This is perhaps the most important distinction between the prison model and the curriculum model. If reality is fundamentally hostile, difficulty becomes evidence of oppression. If reality is fundamentally educational, difficulty can become information. The difference is enormous. A hostile universe asks, how can I defeat what is against me? A lawful universe asks, what is happening and what does it reveal? The second question does not require passivity, it requires precision. You can resist injustice, you can leave harmful environments, you can protect yourself, you can change circumstances, but you do so from understanding rather than from the assumption that existence itself is your enemy. The alchemy of friction. Friction can therefore become a form of alchemy. Fear becomes courage, attachment becomes discernment, loss becomes impermanence understood, failure becomes humility, uncertainty becomes patience, conflict becomes self knowledge, isolation becomes introspection, constraint becomes creativity. The transformation is not guaranteed. Friction alone does not produce wisdom. Consciousness must engage with it. A person can suffer repeatedly without learning. They can become more bitter, more fearful, more defensive, more contracted. The curriculum is not completed simply because difficulty occurs. The lesson is completed when consciousness extracts understanding from the experience. Why some lessons repeat. When a lesson remains incomplete, circumstances may continue to activate the same underlying structure. This does not necessarily mean that the universe is deliberately punishing the individual with repetition. The repetition can arise naturally from the persistence of the structure itself. The same tendency creates similar choices. Similar choices create similar consequences. Similar consequences create similar experiences. The cycle reproduces itself. Change the structure and the cycle can change. This is why karmic patterns can sometimes appear remarkably persistent. The external world is not necessarily repeating the lesson. The consciousness is repeating the mechanism. The exit from repetition. The cycle begins to change when observation replaces automatic identification. Instead of "this always happens to me," there is "what is the pattern?" Instead of "why are people always like this?" there is "what am I consistently participating in?" Instead of "why does life keep testing me?" there is "what capacity is this circumstance exposing?" These questions shift consciousness from victimhood toward investigation. Investigation creates understanding. Understanding creates capacity. Capacity changes action. Action changes consequence. The karmic pattern begins to loosen. Challenge as preparation. Expansion often requires capacities that ordinary comfort does not demand. A person may need patience before they can handle responsibility, discernment before they can handle influence, detachment before they can handle abundance, humility before they can handle recognition, compassion before they can handle power, stability before they can handle expanded perception. The challenge, therefore, prepares the instrument. What looks like an obstacle from one stage can become preparation for another. This does not make the difficulty pleasant. It gives it context. The curriculum is not asking, how much can you suffer? It is asking, what capacity must consciousness develop to move beyond this particular limitation? The paradox of difficulty. There is a paradox at the heart of spiritual development. We often want expansion without the friction required to produce it. We want wisdom without uncertainty, strength without resistance, detachment without loss, courage without fear, patience without delay, understanding without confusion. But these qualities emerge through contact with their opposites. The person does not become patient because patience is intellectually attractive. They become patient because reality refuses to move at the speed they demand. They do not become detached because detachment sounds spiritual. They become detached because they discover that clinging cannot prevent change. They do not become discerning because discernment is admirable. They become discerning because experience demonstrates that appearances cannot always be trusted. The friction supplies the lesson. Working with friction. The practical response to friction is therefore not to seek suffering. It is to become attentive when friction appears. When something repeatedly produces resistance, investigate. Ask, what exactly am I resisting? What expectation is being contradicted? What am I trying to control? What capacity is being tested? What pattern is repeating? What does this reveal about my present structure? What is actually within my influence? What needs to change externally? What needs to change internally? What needs to be accepted rather than changed? These questions prevent two opposite errors. The first is victimhood. Reality is doing this to me. The second is self-blame. Everything bad is my fault. Neither is necessary. A more precise position is, open quote, this is the circumstance. This is my I present response to it. What can be understood from the interaction? Close quote. That is karmic inquiry. The student becomes the observer. Eventually, the most important transformation is not that life becomes frictionless. It is that consciousness becomes capable of observing friction without immediately becoming consumed by it. The student begins to notice, here is fear, here is attachment, here is anger, here is expectation, here is resistance, here is the desire for control, here is the old pattern returning. This recognition creates space. The experience is still present, but consciousness is no longer completely fused with it. The curriculum has become visible, and once the curriculum becomes visible, participation becomes more conscious. Learning through resistance. Friction is one of the most misunderstood features of existence. It is easy to assume that whatever causes pain must be an enemy. But within the framework developed throughout this book, friction can have another function. It reveals, it exposes the limits of present capacity. It activates samskaras. It reveals attachments. It tests integration. It creates feedback. It interrupts unconscious repetition. It can force consciousness to develop qualities that comfort alone could never require. None of this means suffering should be glorified. Pain is not automatically sacred. Difficulty is not automatically deserved. The deeper principle is simpler. Whatever consciousness encounters can become material for consciousness. The circumstance may be personal. It may involve another person. It may arise through the body. It may emerge from society, history, nature, timing, or the wider conditions into which a life unfolds. Whatever form it takes, it enters the field of experience. The obstacle may show where capacity ends. The resistance may show where attachment remains. The recurring pattern may show what has not yet been understood. The disruption may reveal that an old structure can no longer contain what consciousness is becoming. And the challenge may provide precisely the conditions through which a new capacity develops. Karma, in this sense, is not the universe punishing the student. It is the student encountering the consequences and conditions through which the structure of consciousness becomes visible. The curriculum does not need to hurt consciousness in order to teach it. It simply needs to allow consciousness to encounter reality. Reality provides resistance. Consciousness responds. The response produces consequence. The consequence provides experience. Experience creates the possibility of understanding, and understanding changes capacity. This is how friction becomes education. The goal is therefore not to eliminate every difficulty. It is to become increasingly capable of understanding what difficulty is revealing. Eventually, the question changes. We stop asking, how do I make reality stop challenging me? And begin asking, what is reality showing me that I could not yet see? That question marks the beginning of conscious participation in the curriculum. And once resistance is no longer interpreted automatically as punishment, even the hardest terrain can become part of the path toward liberation.